Today is September the 11th, 2018. 17 years ago to this day, the largest terrorist attack in American history took place on U.S. soil. Despite the fact that 9/11 happened on his watch, George W. Bush and his supporters, both at the time and in the years since, have claimed that George W. Bush kept us safe in a time when the world was most dangerous. However, I'm here to call bullshit. George W. Bush and his incompetence allowed 9/11 to occur. Not only that, but his response to 9/11 was completely inept and constitutes the real tragedy of 9/11, as it has created a legacy that is still with us, makes us less safe, and has completely undermined any kind of claim to morality that our country could possibly make on the international stage. So today, I would like to look at George W. Bush's bungling of 9/11 before, during, and after the attack. As we'll see in greater detail in Volume VI of this series, George W. Bush's first 9 months as president were uneventful and completely unimpressive. The only thing that he had really done was to go around the country holding town halls promoting the virtues of his massive tax cuts for the wealthy. And of course, he had passed those tax cuts. So he had achieved a large part of his conservative agenda, and he didn't really have much else to do. As we mentioned, or at least will mention at some point, there wasn't really a big plan for George W. Bush. He basically just wanted to have Bill Clinton's third term. Bill Clinton had achieved many of the things that Reagan had only dreamed of, and George W. Bush just wanted to build on that. So, understandably to some extent, George W. Bush was not really working very hard. He had spent about 1/3 of the time that he had had in office so far on vacation, including a lot of golfing. Bush famously described his golf game as mediocre. And I assume that quite a few people who took him at his word wished that you could say the same thing about his political skills, which made mediocre look like genius. At any rate, it was only on 9/11, the day of the attack, when Bush was finally forced to take a break from taking a break. And for the first time in his life, he was going to be asked to work and to think. Whenever you have a failure of the magnitude of the 9/11 attacks going down, there are many people to blame. It's very rare that it's just one person who fucked up. And one of the people who fucked up the most was CIA Director George Tenet. George Tenet was a Bill Clinton legacy. He had been appointed by Clinton in 1997, and his mission was to rebuild the CIA after Clinton-era budget cuts, remember the Cold War surplus, had decimated the intelligence agencies. So, when Tenet came into office, he saw his main mission as putting more agents in the field. When he came into office, only about 1/4 of the number of agents were available as there had been during the peak of the Cold War. And human intelligence would remain something that the CIA would be short on throughout the rest of the Bush administration. So this is a goal that Tenet never achieved, despite getting massive amounts of funding later on. At any rate, one of the CIA's old mission statements when it was originally founded was that it was to prevent another Pearl Harbor. This is apparently something that Tenet liked to quote both during his time under Clinton and then later under Bush prior to 9/11. He managed to stay on during the Bush years because he cozied up to George W. Bush by delivering intelligence reports in person rather than having junior officials deliver them, as was the norm. In 1999, Tenet formulated a plan to kill bin Laden in Afghanistan, which included some of the earliest Predator drone strikes, something that had not quite been mastered. And this plan ultimately both drained CIA resources by focusing them on active military operational capacity, and that involved the agency in activities that Tenet saw as dubious. He was more into the CIA as an intelligence operation rather than as a paramilitary operation, yet he went along with two presidents who wanted to transform it into something that it should not have been, in his opinion, supposedly. So, because he went along with that, he was unable to achieve his main mission of rebuilding the CIA as an effective intelligence tool. So, well done, Georgie. The intelligence community did have some weaknesses going into 9/11. We've alluded to some of them earlier, and we will look at yet more of them going forward. However, it is clear from events that the U.S. intelligence community, whatever state it was in, was still semi-functional and was able to correctly predict 9/11 and Osama bin Laden's intentions. In June of 2001, Richard Clarke, the U.S.'s leading anti-terrorist expert at the time, and CIA Director George Tenet were both convinced that some kind of attack was imminent, but they thought that this attack from bin Laden would occur in either Israel or in Saudi Arabia. On August 6th, however, there was a memo for George W. Bush from the CIA, and this memo read specifically, bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. This, of course, predicted later in the memo that one of the possible means of delivery would be by hijacking an aircraft. So, this is a full month plus before the attack. And Bush didn't really do anything about that, although we know for sure that he was aware. On another almost unrelated stream, the FBI had found some evidence against one of the future hijackers who was currently taking flying lessons in Minnesota. And they weren't quite able to connect the dots because of a lack of intelligence sharing between the FBI and CIA, the reasons for which we'll get into. Tenet also got wind of more suspicious activities, including the things included in the memo, and he actually met with George W. Bush twice during the month of August in 2001. At one point in one of his Senate hearings, he actually denied that he had met with Bush in August, but now it's known that he actually met with him not once but twice, so that gives you an idea for how credible George Tenet is as a source. Bush and his immediate advisors, and I guess really his immediate advisors don't think Bush had a strong personal opinion on this, since he wasn't really paying a hell of a lot of attention to this kind of stuff. He was more focused on his golf swing. But they were convinced that this was all just a big distraction, and that bin Laden was just playing tough, and that the real threat was Saddam Hussein, and that they needed to focus their efforts on Saddam. Back in 1998, Bill Clinton had bombed Iraq in Operation Desert Fox, and a lot of the neocons, now that they were in power, were eager to go further and possibly get him out of power altogether. So, the people in the Bush administration didn't take these warnings too seriously because they had their eye on the wrong ball. After the attacks, the people who defended George W. Bush's record on national security tried to cast all of the blame on Bill Clinton, and they said that it really effectively happened on his watch. Well, that's not true, but there is a kernel of truth there. Bill Clinton does share in the culpability, even if, as we've seen, there was enough evidence to act and prevent 9/11 from happening, even with the state of the intelligence community. However, Clinton-era cuts had left the intelligence community in a sorry state of affairs. There had been a massive cut to military spending, and that cut had not been very strategic. It had been rather abrupt and not well thought out. There had been very little thought of how do we balance these cuts with maintaining certain capabilities. We'll go into that in more detail when we talk about Bill Clinton and part of why he massively lost the military vote for about half a generation. Anyway, the crux of the problem was that there was not a lot of information sharing between the FBI and the CIA. Those are the two main intelligence gathering groups. One works domestically, one works overseas, and between their two sources of information, you can usually get the info that you need to make decisions on national security. And what you need at that point is someone to collate this information and create a holistic picture of foreign and domestic intelligence. This person could be, say, a president, if you have a president who's active and informed. You could assign this to the vice president. This could be the Secretary of State. This could be the National Security Advisor. There's no reason to create a whole department like the Department of Homeland Defense to fulfill a function that should already be covered by an existing office. But of course, later on, just a preview, that's what George W. Bush did. Another thing that needs to be mentioned once more is that the emphasis of George Tenet's CIA rebuild was on combat, not intelligence, and it was regional, focusing very heavily on Afghanistan, and bin Laden in particular, rather than on global security and bin Laden's operations outside of Afghanistan. So, this was a decision that had originally been made by Bill Clinton and was then carried on by George W. Bush. So, again, there is plenty of blame to go around, and we don't really need to leave anyone with a monopoly on that blame, because plenty of people fucked up. However, I would say the chief responsibility still lies with George W. Bush because he had the tools that he needed to get the job done, even if those tools could have been better. On the morning of September 11th, George W. Bush, the hardest working president in American history up to that point, was hard at work in an elementary school reading a book to some elementary school kids. This was probably to expand his vocabulary and give him a more impressive grammatical range as a speaker. However, when he received news of the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush was like a deer in headlights. He had no idea what to do, and he didn't even know that he was supposed to leave and go deal with the crisis. Maybe he thought that would be Dick Cheney's job. At any rate, it's very clear from his initial response and from later responses that he made that he was utterly unprepared for 9/11 and he had no idea what to do. When he ran for president, he ran to cut rich people's taxes, not to govern and deal with crises. He just wanted to be like Daddy and be able to put president on his gravestone one day. In a 2011 interview, Bush tried to excuse his idiocy by saying that he was operating in the fog of war. And the fog of war applies to battlefield situations where you're literally under fire and when you can't concentrate because there is smoke, dust, noise, people screaming out in agony, other things that require you to act very swiftly without being able to think. If you're a president, while there are certainly situations that are far more stressful than others, there's always some room to think. There are always people who can help you think and give you potential advice. However, George W. Bush was simply not prepared for the responsibilities of the presidency, and his administration was stacked with only one opinion, really. So George W. Bush predictably acted horribly, and his probably well-intentioned actions ended up being deeply costly to the country on every conceivable level. On September 11th itself, and for weeks following, the American public was fixated with the attacks, and everyone was in a state of fear. We all wanted answers, and we all expected leadership from the president and his administration. And for Bush himself, he seems to have shared in that fear and panic, something that is not presidential, although it is understandable and human. He was looking for quick answers, and he wanted to show strength and strike out at those responsible, rather than really think this through and make sure that his response made sense and would secure our safety in the long run. Now, after the attacks, Bush, of course, appeared at Ground Zero, did some other things, and his approval ratings shot up. The nation rallied behind him, and everyone felt bound together. There was a sense of unity, that we're all Americans, and that we're all going to face this great crisis together. So, the upshot of this is that despite coming in and not being all that popular after the 2000 election theft, Bush now had a mandate for the first and only time in his presidency to address this crisis, and it looks like we gave him way too much rope because he used it to hang us all. The problem is that Bush, as I mentioned, was completely clueless when it came to anything related to foreign policy, or actually any policy. He didn't really know what the problem was, or how to fix it, since he was completely unprepared for the challenges of the office. And he also didn't surround himself with the best and the brightest people. At one point, Donald Rumsfeld, his Secretary of State, claimed to not understand the significance of the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims, even though he was a self-proclaimed foreign policy expert, to give but one example of why the Bush administration failed to address the 9/11 crisis in a way that made sense. One of the hallmarks of an educated mind is the ability to take advice without being completely bowled over by the intellect of the person giving you the advice. FDR is a great example. While he was not a first-rate intellect, many people have said he did have a first-rate temperament. He was able to look at different pieces of advice and weigh them. So while he might not have been a great creative thinker, he did have a sense of judgment, and he also had a sense of a bigger picture. George W. Bush, of course, didn't have anything like that. He didn't have that sense of judgment that would enable him to distinguish between good and bad advice. And unfortunately, most of the advice that he got was really bad. His administration was already dominated by neoconservatives, and since they gave the quickest and simplest sounding advice, they tended to be listened to over people like Colin Powell, who took a more moderate stance. So, going into the 9/11 crisis, the Bush administration was loaded to the gills with neocons. Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, all three of these guys were founding members of the Project for a New American Century, the official neoconservative think tank. Now, Project for a New American Century was founded in 1997. This, as I mentioned, had many Bush officials, including more than the three I just mentioned, and its goals were to secure American power through a military buildup, what they called a Reagan-esque approach. And they also advocated for regime change in 1998 in Iraq. They criticized Bill Clinton for only bombing Saddam and imposing a no-fly zone, and not simply invading and overthrowing him and replacing his regime with a democracy. Bush now turned to these neocons for advice and guidance, and by endorsing their beliefs, what he did was abandon his campaign stance of non-interventionism. Remember, he had actually been to Gore's left on foreign policy, but now he's about to take a hard right turn and become a sort of exaggerated parody of someone like a Ronald Reagan. On September 11th, 2001, 19 Islamic extremists hijacked aircraft and killed 3,000 Americans while injuring or wounding 6,000 others. Countless thousands of other people would then be affected by grief because of the loss of loved ones, and they would never feel anywhere near as secure again when going to the airport or being in a large public place. However, that was an attack, not a tragedy. The tragedy of 9/11 is the response that America made to those events. For something to truly be a tragedy, there has to be an undoing caused by internal forces and trends. And the Bush administration's response to 9/11 is a classic tragedy where the combination of George W. Bush's ignorance and the evil and greed of his subordinates really came to characterize America and to ruin any chance that we had of maintaining or enhancing our standing in the world and making the world a better or more peaceful place. Bush and his advisors managed to turn the hunt for Osama bin Laden, a completely reasonable undertaking, into a regime change war after they bungled trying to find him, and then they turned that regime change war into a permanent occupation which continues to this day, draining billions of dollars away from America into a fruitless and pointless endeavor that does nothing more than enrich defense contractors. The war on terror is a nebulous and never-ending struggle against nobodies, where the U.S. government shells out billions of dollars to defense contractors to build million-dollar weapons to kill people whose net worth is $2.47 in a cave. The USA Patriot Act was an assault on civil liberties the like of which we have never seen. The idea being that because some terrorist had managed to achieve something because the government was asleep meant that we needed to give up many of our rights and privileges in order to prevent that from happening again, and that we needed to really throw money at the government's defense capabilities to make sure that it was able to do its job rather than thinking through how it should be doing its job and funding it in a more strategic way. The Iraq War of 2003, the ultimate result of this, George W. Bush was sold on a war of aggression, and he managed to package it as part of a war on terror in order to prevent Saddam Hussein from using weapons of mass destruction. These weapons of mass destruction, of course, never existed, and we are still in Iraq. One of the long-term side effects of the Iraq invasion is that it destabilized the region and contributed to the rise of ISIS. We also saw, most disturbingly, even if this is not quite the most damaging of these things, in a way it is the most disturbing, we had an entire presidential administration and an entire political party which rededicated themselves to defending the righteousness of torture. This is supposed to be America. These are people who claim that they are spreading democracy and freedom throughout the world, yet they are arguing very aggressively against the due process of law or observing agreed-upon norms for international warfare. So this is the real tragedy of 9/11, and this is why George W. Bush thoroughly fucked up our response to 9/11 as a nation. Going forward, we will examine all of these things in greater detail and look at the little fuck ups that contributed to the greater fuck ups.